In this video, you are going to learn everything you need to know about Maxed Fabric deployment pipelines for the DP-700 exam. Stay tuned! Welcome to the video. My name is Aleksi and on this channel I cover Microsoft data platform related topics. In this video we will continue our DP-700 exam prep series and a link to the entire playlist can be found in the description. This is the episode 22 in the DP-700 exam prep series, and in this episode we will cover deployment pipelines. The whole CI/CD/deployment topic with Fabric is quite wide, and in this video we are going to cover topics that are relevant for the DP-700 exam. Also, we are going to cover a few nice to know things that are not in the scope of the exam, but could be very helpful to understand and know in the real world scenarios. Like in every episode in this series, we will first start with the theory section, followed by demos/tutorials on Fabric, and then we end the episode with few questions related to topics covered in this episode, so that you can test your knowledge. But now let's get started. Let's first start by covering what are deployment pipelines and what they are used for in Maxed Fabric. Let's imagine that we have three workspaces in Maxed Fabric and each one of those workspaces represents one environment, meaning that first we have a workspace for development work, then a workspace for testing, and finally a workspace for production where our data solutions provide insight and value for business. And now we would be developing a data solution in development workspace that results us having some Fabric items like data pipelines, notebooks, and data stores. And now we would like to take our cool data solution to the test environment for testing. Of course, we could manually copy all of our work to that environment, but that sounds like a poor way of doing things for me, and we are not going to go through that route. So we are actually going to set up a deployment pipeline in Maxed Fabric that will deploy our items from the development workspace to the test workspace for testing. And after we are done testing our new data solution, we can use the deployment pipeline to deploy those same items from the test workspace to production workspace, where our data solution then starts to provide insight and value for the business. So, to summarize, deployment pipelines are built-in tool in Maxed Fabric that help manage content lifecycle. And since this is a built-in tool in Maxed Fabric, it is very easy to set up and no coding is required to get your deployment pipelines and processes up and running. They can be used to deploy changes from one workspace/environment to another. They help teams develop, validate, and release content in a controlled way. Now you should have an idea what deployment pipelines are all about on the surface level, and next we can go a bit deeper and learn how to configure and use them. Now let's take a look at how deployment pipeline UI looks in Maxed Fabric. Here on the screen we can see a deployment pipeline as it looks in the Maxed Fabric. There are many things and concepts that I want to point out from this picture so that you will understand more about deployment pipelines. We can see that in the UI we have three different blocks: dev, test, and prod, one for each environment. If we are using three environment setup, that is quite typical in data engineering work. In deployment pipeline terminology, these blocks are called stages. So we have three different stages in this deployment pipeline. Basically, stage represents one step in the content lifecycle. Each one of these stages is linked to a separate workspace, and we have one workspace for development work, one for testing, and one for production. In a deployment pipeline, there has to be at least 2 stages, and there could be a maximum of 10 stages. Changes are then compared between the different stages so that we know what should be deployed from one stage to another when we are doing the deployment. And we are going to dive deeper into this comparison shortly. In this screenshot, we have actually the test stage selected, so we are going to deploy from dev to test. The selected stage is called a target stage, since this is the target of our deployment. Then the stage we are deploying from is called a source stage. In this case, that is the dev stage. We can also see in the UI that we have test stage selected and we are deploying from dev. Next, things get a bit unlogical from the UI perspective in my opinion, when we take a look at the comparison process underneath our stages. We can see that we have selected stage items column that actually represents the items that are found in our target stage, meaning in the test workspace in our case. Then on the right side of that, we have our source stage items that represent items that we have in our source stage, meaning in the development workspace. In my opinion, this can be a bit confusing, since I would rather want to have them other way around, since the stage UI on the top is moving from left to right, but this comparison UI is moving from right to left. But this is how things are currently in Fabric. Maybe for somebody else this logic works better than for me, but let's not allow this to bother us too much. When deploying items with deployment pipelines, there is a process called item pairing that happens. This means that Fabric keeps track of the item between different stages to know how a specific item has changed. Items are actually paired based on their unique internal IDs and not just by their name, so that Fabric can identify that if some item has been just renamed or is it a new item. Based on this item pairing and comparison, each item is given one of 4 statuses. First, we have the status same as source, which means that no changes to that specific item has been detected, and thus there is no need to deploy that specific item. In the screenshot, we can see that both lakehouses have this status. Then we have the status different from source, which indicates that this specific item has changed somehow. Basically, the most kinds of typical changes to the item will trigger this status. In this example, we can see that the notebook has this status, so most likely some new development work and changes have been done to that notebook after our last deployment. Also remember, since we are not pairing with names and we are using internal IDs, name changes will be also seen with this status. Then we have the status only in source. That indicates that the item is new and has not been deployed from the source stage to the target stage previously. And lastly, we have a status not in source, which means that the item doesn't exist in the source stage. This typically happens when somebody creates an item manually. In this case, we have a notebook called Random Testing Notebook. That can be found in the test workspace, but not in the development workspace. Now, if you're wondering what will happen to that notebook when we do deployment from dev to test, the answer is nothing, since deployment will not have any impact to this item. This takes me to my last point that I want to cover on this slide. That is that this deployment process can be done in selective manner, and we can choose the items that we want to deploy, so we don't have to deploy every item every time. Of course, it could be debated that should we deploy everything when we do the deployment, but deployment pipelines give some flexibility in this manner. Next, let's talk about deployment rules that can be used in deployment pipelines to change configurations of some items between stages. Let's imagine that we have again 3 environments set up, which means that we have a deployment pipeline with 3 stages. In our development workspace, we have a notebook and 2 lakehouses. One of those lakehouses is being used as a default lakehouse for the notebook. Now, if we would deploy these items to test workspace without using deployment rules, the default lakehouse would be the test workspace version of the lakehouse we had in the dev workspace. In the most cases, this is the desired outcome of the deployment. However, it is possible to define deployment rules and change this default lakehouse to be something else. Now let's do a deployment from test to prod and define a deployment rule that will change the default lakehouse to point to that other lakehouse in our prod workspace. Notebook is not the only item that currently supports deployment rules, and there are a handful of other items that can be seen on this table. As we can see, the current coverage of deployment rules is not very extensive, but it's good to remember that in some cases deployment rules could be used to solve some issues where a specific item is pointing to a wrong place after deployment. For example, with a mirror database, we can use deployment rules to change the data source to be a different database for each stage/environment. That could be useful in some cases. So, to summarize, deployment rules in Maxed Fabric let you change settings like data sources or parameters when moving content between stages. This helps to make sure that each stage uses the right setup without manual changes. It keeps deployment smooth and reduces errors. Of course, defining these deployment rules can be quite annoying if you have a ton of items that require them. And lastly, remember to check the current coverage and state of deployment rules, especially if you're watching this long after I have released this video. Before we go to the demo/tutorial part of this video, let's cover a few more things about deployment in Maxed Fabric that are good to know but not that much in the scope of DP-700 or at least the current iteration of it. First, it is good to know that not all items are supported by deployment pipelines, and typically brand new items that are in preview are not supported. Typically, deployment pipeline support goes hand in hand with version control and Git support. Also, there have been cases where item is already in general availability and it is still not supported by deployment pipelines. Just keep this in mind and check the latest support status for items that you're interested in having as part of your data solution. Another good point to highlight here is that deployment pipelines can be used with Git-enabled workspaces. Also, it is good to note that deployment pipelines don't use Git when doing the deployment, and they just compare raw items between workspaces or stages. In one typical setup, you could have a Git-enabled development workspace, and then deploy items to non-Git-enabled test workspace, and from test to non-Git-enabled prod workspace. What comes to permissions related to deployment pipelines, you can grant access to users and groups to deployment pipelines that you make. Currently, it is only possible to grant admin-level access to deployment pipelines, and we don't have any other roles. Item ownerships are another thing that I want to mention here briefly. So basically, the user who will do the deployment will be the owner of the deployed items. This could play a role in many cases, since typically in Fabric the item owner's credentials are being used to execute the item when it runs. One thing that could be used to mitigate some of the dependency to personal user accounts as item owners is to run the deployment pipeline via API using Service Principal or SPN, because then the SPN would be the owner of the items. This way you could also tie Fabric deployments as part of the other possible deployments in Azure DevOps or GitHub, for example. Also, it is good to know that there is an alternative way of doing these deployments by using Fabric CI/CD Python library. This is a code-first solution that uses Fabric's REST APIs in the background for doing the deployment. This is not in the scope of the current iteration of the DP-700, but just wanted to mention this here briefly so that you can explore this option if you want. Then we have a relatively new item in Fabric called Variable Library that can be used to create workspace level variables. With Variable Library, you can create variable sets and alternative versions of those variables that can be activated in different workspaces/environments. This item is a very nice addition, and it already works with data pipelines, notebooks, and Lakehouse shortcuts. However, at the time of recording, this feature is not part of the DP-700 scope, and I will not cover it more in this video. All in all, Fabric deployment and CI/CD support is no means perfect, but it has been getting a lot better lately, and especially Variable Library has a ton of potential making deployments way smoother. In an ideal world, no manual steps would be needed when deploying solutions to production, but this is not the case yet. There are still things like item-level accesses that cannot be done via any API and must be added manually. Let's hope that in the near future we get to a situation where not a single manual adjustment is needed when deploying solutions to a completely empty production workspace, and everything can be handled via deployment processes and APIs. But like said, many of the things covered on this slide are not in the scope of DP-700, at least not yet. So leave a comment to the comment section down below if you'd like to see me cover more advanced and in-depth topics in upcoming videos about deployments and CI/CD that are not in the scope of DP-700. But now it is time to open Fabric and do a demo/tutorial together about setting up and doing deployments using deployment pipelines. Before we open Fabric, I would like to know that I spent a ton of my free time creating these videos for you, and that's why I'd like to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more DP-700 and Fabric content. This doesn't cost you anything, and I would highly appreciate that. Also, if you'd like to support the channel with a cup of coffee, you can do so by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee link that can be found in the description. But now, let's go to Fabric. Now we are in Fabric, and I have my DP-700 tutorial workspace open here that we have been using for most of the tutorials in this series. Then I have created two new workspaces. I have this DP-700 test workspace, and then I have this DP-700 prod workspace. But as we can see, both of these workspaces are empty. And now I would like to deploy the contents of this dev workspace first to the test workspace and from to the test to the production workspace. And for that, we are going to use the Fabric deployment pipelines. So let's start by configuring a deployment pipeline. We can find deployment pipelines here from the three dot and then clicking deployment pipelines. Then we want to create a new deployment pipeline. Let's name this deployment pipeline DP-700, and then we could add a description what this pipeline is all about. But I'm not going to add that description now. So let's click next. And now we can see these different stages here. To each stage, we would define a workspace to which we want to do the deployment. Now we have this development stage here, then we have the test stage here, and then we have the production stage here. And of course, we could add here more stages by clicking this plus button here. And remember that we can have maximum of 10 stages here, and we need to have at least 2 stages. But yeah, I think we're happy with these 3 stages, and we can have these development, test, and production stages that correspond with our workspaces. Then we can click this create and continue. And now we can choose the workspace that is used for each stage. And for this development stage, I want to, of course, assign this development workspace. So let's assign that from this list. Now we have assigned that workspace, and we can see that some of the items in that workspace are not supported by the deployment pipelines, like we discussed in the previous section, that not all items are supported. But yeah, let's click continue, since we are not going to care about that too much there. For example, we have that mirrored Azure Databricks catalog that is not supported by Git and not supported by deployment pipelines. Then next we want to assign our test workspace to this test stage, and let's do that. And now we have assigned that, and we can already see that comparison here that we are going to come back shortly. And now let's assign this production workspace to our prod workspace. So let's find that, and there is the prod workspace, and then we can click and assign that. And now we have assigned all the workspace to these different stages in this deployment pipeline. And now we could actually do a deployment from the development environment to the test environment. So if we click this test environment stage, we can see a comparison between the development stage and the test stage. But like I showed to you, this is a little bit funky in my opinion, because we can see the test as a selected stage here, and then we are comparing it to that development stage, and items in that development stage can be seen here. So in my opinion, this logic here is other way around as it should be. But here we can actually do that selective deployment, so we can select the items that we want to deploy. So we don't have to deploy everything that we have in our development workspace. But in this case, I actually want to deploy all, so we can click here, and this will actually select everything that we have in the development workspace. And now we can click that deploy button here, and that will actually start that deployment from development to test. And now we can click this deploy button here. And here we can see that we are deploying a bunch of new items to that test workspace. Of course, because that test workspace is completely new and we haven't done any deployments to that workspace from dev, so there is no item pairing yet between these two workspaces. And here we could actually add a node to this deployment, so I will add some node here so that we can see how that will look later on. But now we can click deploy then, and this will start the deployment. And this deployment will actually take a little moment, so I will skip a little bit forward from here. And now our deployment is done, and we have successfully deployed all the supported items from the development workspace to our test workspace. And we can go to the test workspace, and let's refresh this, and we should see some items here. And we can see all the same items here that we have in the development workspace, excluding those unsupported items, like that mirrored Azure Databricks catalog. But now the deployment is done, and we can go back to the deployment pipeline. And here we should see a comparison between these two stages. And here we can see that some items have actually changed after the deployment. I don't know why the KQL database keeps changing always after the deployment, but typically we should now have the same as source status in almost everything. And with folders, we have to go inside that folder and see what is the status of the item. And since we have now done our first deployment to the test workspace, we have some item pairing going on between these two stages, so that Fabric knows what is the state of that same item in these two different workspaces, so that it can track those changes like we discussed here. But this already opens up us the possibility to create deployment rules by clicking this lightning bolt icon here. That will open up this deployment rules tab. And here we can define deployment rules to some of the supported items. I don't actually know why this is already showing data pipelines here, because to my understanding we cannot yet define deployment rules for those. But we can click, for example, data pipeline open here, and we can see that we cannot define rules here. But for example, for this mirror database, we can define data source rule. And here we would be able to configure this rule for this mirror database so that we would, for example, use a different connection in the test environment that we are using in the development environment. So basically that we would have this to connect to a different database than in the dev environment. But yeah, I'm not going to define that kind of a rule here, and we can close this. But this is the place where you could be able to define those rules for these different items that are supported by the deployment rules. Now let's close this. And I can show to you quickly that with production stage we cannot define those rules because we haven't done that deployment there. So there can be this kind of a chicken and egg problem when defining these rules, that you first have to do the deployment and then define the rule. It would be helpful that if you could define those rules before the deployment. So in my opinion that would be more of a correct approach with these. But for now we have to do it this way. And remember that with these deployment pipelines, we are actually comparing the development workspace to test workspace. And after we have deployed items to the test workspace, then we are comparing the contents of the test workspace to the production workspace. And if you remember, we have connected our development workspace to Git. But like I discussed in the theory section, the Git and the deployment pipelines are completely separate features. Of course, version control and deployment pipelines complement each other nicely, but they do not talk with each other. With this Git integration, we are able to update the items in the workspace, and then the deployment pipeline will just read the contents of the workspace, and it doesn't really know that is our workspace attached to Git or not. But yeah, with Git you can do many other cool things like branch out to another workspace and develop your features there and use this Fabric in a version control manner. So I would encourage you to use both of these features in your environment. Next, let's take a look at some of these tabs that we have here in deployment pipelines. Here first we have this deployment history button, and if we click that, we can see a deployment history for this specific pipeline. And here we can see that we have been deploying to test, and that was the initial deployment that I did. And here we can actually see that note that I added to that deployment. And here we can see the ID for this deployment. But yeah, this will tell you some information about the past deployments that happened with the deployment pipeline. And then we have this manage access, and here we can actually add more people to be admin of this deployment pipeline. But currently we have only the option to add admins here, so we don't have any other roles like, for example, deployment pipeline contributor or deployment pipeline viewer. So the admin role is currently the only one that we can grant for the deployment pipeline. Then we have the settings tab, and here in the settings tab we only have basically the name and the description, so nothing interesting here. And then behind that 3 dots we have this delete pipeline, so if we would like to delete this deployment pipeline, it could be done here. And next we could do a deployment to the production workspace, but now let's do a selective deployment, and I will just select some specific items that I want to deploy from the test workspace to the production workspace. And now I have done that selection, and I want to deploy this lakehouse, and then I want to deploy this one notebook. So we can click this deploy button and just deploy those 2 items. And here we can see that we are deploying those, and let's click deploy. Now this should be a lot faster since we are only just deploying those 2 items. And now the deployment is done, and it took like 10 seconds compared to the previous deployment that I did that took like 2 minutes or something, that it was way longer. But now we can go to the production workspace and refresh this, and we should see only those 2 items here. So we have the lakehouse and then we have that notebook. So we have successfully done this selective deployment there. And if we go back to the deployment pipeline, we can see now if we click the production stage here, we can see that when we're comparing to the test stage, we can see that we have there 2 items that are the same as in the source, and then we have those other items that were not deployed yet, so we can see that those are only present in the source. Next, let's have a question about these deployment pipelines so that you can test your knowledge. But before we do that, I would like to tell you about this website called certiace.com that offers free custom-made practice questions to Microsoft certification exams like DP-700 and DP-700. And I'm actually one of the co-founders of this website. So after watching this video, go check out certiace.com. But now let's have that practice question. Our question today is, which of the following statement about deployment pipelines and Git integration in Microsoft Fabric is true? A. Deployment pipelines require Git integration for each workspace that are used in the deployment pipeline stages. B. Deployment pipeline uses the latest state in the Git repo for deployment in each stage. C. Git integration is only mandatory for a workspace that is used as the first stage of a deployment pipeline. D. Git integration is not needed at all for using deployment pipelines. Now think about the answer for a moment and pause the video. I will reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is D, since like I explained in the video, Git integration is no means mandatory for using deployment pipelines, and they are completely separate features. I really want to highlight this since this is a different approach compared to many other platforms and to data platform setups using Azure tools. Of course, Git integration nicely complements the use of deployment pipelines, since you want to do your work in a version-controlled manner. But the deployment pipeline doesn't use Git in any way directly, and it just compares whatever is found in the source workspace/stage, whether those items are synced to Git or not. This is all that I wanted to cover here today. If you'd like to continue your learning journey towards getting that DP-700 badge, check out the next video in this series. But now I thank you for watching and see you in that video.